Dawn came quietly, as it always had. In a small settlement near the eastern fens, a man stepped out from the low doorway of his timber house and paused for a moment, looking up at the sky as he did every morning. It was late spring, the time when the earth should already be beginning to harden beneath the feet, when the damp of winter retreats and the fields start to show signs of readiness. Instead, the light felt thin. The sun was visible above the horizon, but it appeared muted, its edges blurred as though something lay between it and the ground below. The thatch on the roofs still held moisture from the night. The soil did not yet loosen in the hand. When he breathed, the air felt heavy rather than cold, carrying no promise of warmth as the day advanced. In other years, the sun would have gained strength as the morning wore on, sharpening shadows and drawing heat into the fields. But this time it remained unchanged, pale and distant, offering light without effect. The sky itself was neither overcast nor clear, only washed of depth, as if the day had stalled partway into itself. Beyond the houses, the fields lay quiet. Birds were present, but fewer voices rose from the hedges, and those that did seemed restrained. The cattle remained where they had been left, shifting their weight, tearing slowly at grass that had been slow to grow this year. There was no frost on the ground, no snow, nothing that could be named as a sign of disaster. And yet, something in the season felt delayed. The warmth that should have arrived by now had not come, and the days passed without improvement. No one spoke of it openly at first. Farmers were accustomed to uncertainty. A poor week meant little, and even a cold month could be endured. But as the mornings continued to break in the same flat light, and the sun failed again and again to strengthen, it became harder to dismiss. The season was not unfolding as it should. The sun remained visible, present in the sky, and yet it did not do the work it was expected to do. Welcome to the Candlelight Historian. Tonight, we step into the shadows of the past, to a time when the sun dimmed, the harvest failed, and Britain entered one of the darkest decades in its history. The Fragile Edge. To understand what followed in the year 536, it is necessary to understand the world that existed before it. Britain was a land of narrow margins, where survival was rarely assured, and prosperity, when it came, was modest and temporary. The physical remains of Roman rule still lay across the countryside. Stretches of broken stone road, the shells of villas reused for shelter or stone, and the memory of an administration that had once organized supply and movement across the island, but no longer did so. In the west and the north, British kingdoms occupied the uplands and hill country, where life was shaped by pasture rather than plough. Wealth was measured in cattle, and survival depended on seasonal movement and careful management of herds. In the east, newer settlements of Germanic migrants had taken hold along river valleys and lighter soils. These communities lived in small, kin-based groups, their fortunes closely tied to the success of their fields and the reliability of the seasons. There was little room for excess. What was gathered in one year was intended to carry people into the next. Grain was stored, but not in quantities that could absorb repeated failure. In the eastern lowlands, farmers watched the wheat and barley closely, knowing that too much rain, a shortened summer, or a mistimed cold spell could leave the grain standing green and useless in the fields. A single disrupted season could undo years of careful work. In the west, the danger took a different form. Livestock survived the winter only if enough hay had been cut and dried during the summer months. Without sustained warmth, the grass could not be properly cured, and without fodder, animals could not be kept alive through the cold season. When that happened, herds were slaughtered early, providing food for a time, but leaving nothing to breed from when spring returned. Across Britain, life was organized locally. Authority rarely extended beyond the immediate territory of a king or war leader, and there was no system capable of moving food from one region to another in times of shortage. Valleys, hill settlements, and coastal communities endured or failed largely on their own. It was a world that functioned only as long as the seasons remained predictable, and only as long as the land continued to respond in familiar ways. The year the sun failed. When the cloud arrived in the spring of 536, it did not announce itself with thunder or storm. There was no single morning when people could say that the sky had changed. Instead, the light simply failed to improve. Days passed, and the familiar strengthening of the sun never came. A thin veil settled over the island and remained there, unmoving, indifferent to the turning of the weeks. It was not the mist that rose from rivers or crept inland from the sea. It did not bead on the skin or drift away by midday. This was something drier, higher, and more persistent, a haze that dulled the sky and stripped the sun of its force. The light reached the ground, but it carried no warmth. Shadows softened, then disappeared altogether, until even at midday the world appeared flat, drained of contrast, as though depth itself had been reduced. Far to the south, chroniclers wrote of a sun that shone without brightness, pale as the moon, and unable to cast a shadow. In Britain, where no such chroniclers watched the sky, the change was understood through the body rather than the page. The seasons lost their shape. May passed without warmth. June arrived, but the long evenings failed to glow. The light lingered, but it did not nourish. What should have been the richest part of the year unfolded in a perpetual half-day, neither dark nor truly bright. For a population that measured time by the height of the sun and the length of the day, this was more than bad weather. It unsettled the order by which life was understood. The sun governed work, rest, and ritual. It marked the seasons, determined when fields were ploughed and when hay was cut, and stood as a visible sign that the world was functioning as it should. When it weakened, when it ceased to behave as expected, the change was felt as a disturbance in the structure of existence itself. The sky took on a uniform, milky hue, neither clouded nor clear. Moisture lingered in the air, yet the temperature refused to rise. The days felt stalled, as though caught between seasons that could no longer complete their passage. Plants pushed upward slowly, uncertain, their growth thin and delayed. Leaves appeared late and remained small. Grain stayed green far longer than it should have, refusing to harden beneath a sun that no longer fed it. In the forests, the great oaks responded in silence. Their roots drew what little warmth they could from the soil. Their leaves gathered what light remained, and still they struggled. That year their growth slowed almost to nothing. When their rings formed, they were narrow to the point of invisibility, a quiet, biological record of a summer that never truly arrived. The trees endured, but they remembered. For the people who lived beneath them, the failure of the sun was not yet famine, not yet death. It was something more unsettling. It was the sense that the year had gone wrong, and that no amount of patience would set it right again. Bread did not come. By the time autumn approached in the year 536, unease had hardened into something more constant. Through the late summer, people had continued to wait. Grain can be late, they told themselves. A few warm weeks can still redeem a poor season. Fields were watched closely, day after day, as though attention alone might coax the crops to maturity. But the change never came. In the eastern lowlands, the grain remained green far longer than it should have. Wheat, which depended on sustained warmth to harden within the husk, stayed soft and pliant, bending under its own weight. August passed without the sun ever gathering strength. When cooler nights arrived earlier than expected, the stalks darkened and the heads began to rot. What had looked like a delayed harvest revealed itself, at last, as a failed one. The fields were cut anyway, out of habit as much as hope, but there was little to bring in. What was gathered spoiled quickly, damp and unusable. The Irish annals, recording the shared fate of Britain and Ireland, named this disaster with a brevity that left no room for comfort. Perditio panis, the failure of bread. It was not a poetic phrase, nor an exaggeration. Bread was the substance around which daily life was organized. It was eaten at every meal, relied upon by rich and poor alike, and counted on to bridge the space between one season and the next. Without it, the delicate balance of the year collapsed. Even in ordinary times, late spring brought hardship. Stores ran low before the new harvest was ready, and households endured what was known simply as the lean season. In this year, that season did not end. It extended into summer, then into autumn, and finally into winter, stretching hunger across months that should have brought relief. There was no moment when the pressure eased, no turning point when the grain came in and life resumed its expected course. In the west and the uplands, the crisis took a different shape. There, wealth was measured not in sacks of grain but in living bodies, cattle that provided milk, traction, and status. Their survival depended on the hay harvest, cut in summer and dried in the open air. In the year of the dimmed sun, the grass was slow to grow and slower still to dry. Hay lay spread across the fields, turned again and again in the hope of warmth that never arrived. Rain and damp air darkened it, and mold crept in. By the time it was gathered, much of it was useless. Without fodder, the cattle could not be kept alive through the winter. One by one, difficult decisions were made. Animals were slaughtered early, not because they were ready, but because there was no way to feed them. For a brief time, there was meat in abundance. It was eaten quickly, preserved where possible, shared among kin. But everyone understood what it meant. Each animal killed was not merely food, but the loss of milk, calves, and labor in the years to come. It was sustenance purchased at the cost of the future. As the winter of 537 settled in, the soundscape of the countryside changed. The lowing of cattle faded from the valleys. The steady rhythm of flails beating grain fell silent. Smoke still rose from hearths, but less often, and from fewer places. Houses grew quieter as hunger weakened voices and thinned bodies. In storage pits and small granaries, seed grain was kept apart from the rest, guarded carefully through the early months of winter. It represented the possibility of renewal, the hope that fields might yet be planted when spring returned. But as hunger deepened and choices narrowed, even this boundary failed. Grain meant for sowing was drawn out and ground down, mixed with whatever could be found to stretch it further. The flour it produced was thin and bitter, but it kept people alive a little longer. By the time the year turned, many understood what they had done. They had crossed a line from which there was no easy return. To eat the seed was to accept that the next harvest was already in doubt. But hunger left little room for principle. Survival became a matter of days, then of mornings, then of whether one could rise at all. Bread did not come, and without it, the year ceased to move forward. War in a starving land. Famine rarely announces itself with sudden violence. It works first by eroding habits, then expectations, and finally restraint. By the year 537, hunger had ceased to be an individual burden and had become a shared condition across much of Britain. As stores emptied and herds vanished, the small agreements that held communities together began to loosen. At first, people adapted quietly. Households tightened their use of food, kin networks were stretched, favors called in, debts remembered. What could be shared was shared, but not all needs could be met. When scarcity persisted, generosity became selective. When it persisted longer still, suspicion followed. A full storehouse, once a sign of good management, now invited questions. A surviving cow or a hidden pit of grain became something to conceal rather than display. The line between neighbour and threat did not vanish all at once. It thinned. A request was refused. A loan could not be repaid. Boundaries that had once been flexible hardened into limits. In a landscape where most people lived close to subsistence, even in good years, prolonged hunger turned difference into grievance and grievance into action. The annals of Wales record that in this year there was a mortalitas magna, a great mortality, across Britain and Ireland. Hunger alone can account for much of this loss, but not all of it. Famine created the conditions in which violence could flourish. Disputes over land, grazing rights and remaining stores were no longer moderated by the expectation that better times would return. When survival narrowed to the immediate present, the future ceased to restrain behaviour. It was in this context that the Battle of Camlan was later placed. Stripped of the ornamentation added by centuries of retelling, it was likely not a grand clash of armies, but a hard, localized conflict between exhausted groups competing for control of diminishing resources. The death of Arthur and Medrawt, as recorded in the annals, marks not simply the fall of leaders, but the failure of a fragile order to hold under sustained pressure. Whatever authority had remained from the post-Roman world proved insufficient to contain the strain. Across the island, smaller conflicts unfolded without record. Fields that might still produce were contested. Valleys with access to water or shelter drew competing claims. In the east, the advance of Anglo-Saxon settlements slowed and fractured as groups turned inward, defending what little could still be relied upon. Movement became dangerous. Trust contracted to the immediate household, then sometimes even further. The landscape itself began to reflect this change. Settlements were abandoned or pulled back to more defensible positions. Paths that had once connected communities became boundaries to guard. Fire, once a tool of clearing and renewal, became a weapon. What could not be protected was sometimes destroyed, denied to others rather than surrendered. The great mortality of that year was not the product of hunger alone, nor of violence alone, but of their combination. Hunger weakened bodies and judgment alike. Violence followed not from cruelty, but from desperation. By the time the year ended, Britain was no longer simply hungry. It was divided, exhausted, and uncertain whether the old ways of living together could ever be restored. The second winter. By the end of the decade's third year, a cautious sense of relief began to take hold among those who remained. The light had improved, if only slightly. The sun was still pale, but it no longer hung in the sky without effect. Shadows returned, faint and indistinct at first, then more certain as the months passed. The air warmed enough to suggest that the worst might be over. Fields that had lain neglected were cleared again. Fences were repaired where materials allowed. What seed grain remained was counted carefully, measured against the land that could still be worked and the strength of the hands left to work it. No one spoke of abundance, but survival once again seemed possible. The expectation was not of plenty, only of continuity, of a year that might finally behave as years were meant to do. This fragile optimism did not last. In the year 540, the light failed once more, not suddenly, and not in a way that could be easily named, but unmistakably. The sky took on the same drained quality it had worn before, the same uniform whiteness that flattened the landscape and stripped warmth from the sun. Days passed, then weeks, and the familiar signs of recovery faltered. What had begun to grow slowed again. The seasons hesitated, then retreated. Unbeknownst to those beneath it, a second eruption had carried new material into the high atmosphere, renewing the veil that had only just begun to lift. For the people of Britain, the cause was irrelevant. What mattered was the return of a pattern they recognized all too well. The sun was visible, yet ineffective. The air remained damp and cold. The year once again refused to unfold. The impact of this second failure was different from the first. The initial famine had been met with effort, with improvisation, cooperation, and the use of every remaining reserve. By now, those reserves were gone. Granaries were empty. Herds had been reduced to shadows of their former size. Tools were worn, and the people who used them were thinner, weaker, and fewer. The oak trees of Ireland recorded this moment without comment. In the years that followed, their growth slowed further still, producing rings so narrow they were almost lost to the eye. What they recorded was not simply cold, but persistence, a continuation of conditions that denied recovery year after year. This period came to be remembered much later as a second winter, though it did not arrive with snow alone. It was a winter of decisions without good outcomes. The remaining grain could be eaten, prolonging life for a short time at the cost of the next planting. Or it could be sown, offering a future that might never arrive. For many households, neither option promised survival. Some stayed and endured as long as they could. Others left. Homes were not abandoned in panic or flame, but gradually, as the effort required to remain outweighed the hope of improvement, roofs sagged and were not repaired, walls collapsed and were not rebuilt. What could be carried was taken, what could not was left behind. At settlements like West Stow and Mucking, this change is visible in the ground itself. The rhythm of rebuilding falters, new structures become fewer and simpler. Objects associated with daily life appear less often, as though fewer hands were present to lose them. Continuity gives way to drift, not always away from a place, but away from the idea that the place could sustain life as it once had. People moved in search of marginal improvement, a valley less exposed to wind, land that thawed a little earlier, a place where water did not linger so long in the soil. Movement was not migration in the old sense, nor conquest. It was retreat, measured in short distances and uncertain choices. By the time this second winter took hold, the disaster was no longer defined by hunger alone. It was defined by fatigue. The effort required to begin again had become greater than the strength left to attempt it. Britain had not been destroyed, but it had been thinned and unsettled, its people reduced to endurance rather than expectation. When the plague arrived. In the early years of the 540s, illness reached Britain by routes that had once sustained it. There was no announcement, no clear beginning that could be marked or remembered. People did not know that a new kind of sickness had arrived. They only knew that some did not recover as they once had. For generations, Britain had remained connected to the wider world by sea. Along the western coasts, ships continued to arrive from Gaul, from Iberia, and from the Mediterranean, carrying wine, oil, fine pottery, and other goods reserved for those who could still afford them. At places like Tintagel, these connections had endured even through years of hardship. The traffic was lighter now, the cargoes smaller, but the routes remained open. What travelled with those ships was not only merchandise. Rats moved easily through holds and storehouses, following grain and refuse. Fleas followed the rats. None of this was unusual. What was different was what those fleas now carried. By the time the sickness appeared, the population it encountered had already been reduced and weakened. Years of poor harvests had stripped bodies of reserves. Malnutrition had thinned children and slowed recovery from ordinary illness. When this new disease took hold, it did not spread evenly or predictably. Some settlements were touched lightly. Others lost entire households within weeks. The symptoms were unfamiliar and frightening: sudden fevers, swellings in the neck or groin, weakness that advanced faster than any hunger had done. People who had survived years of scarcity found themselves unable to rise from their beds. Death followed quickly, sometimes before help could be summoned, sometimes before the nature of the illness could even be discussed. For a long time, it was assumed that Britain had escaped the worst of the Great Plague that swept the Mediterranean world. There were no detailed chronicles to contradict that belief, but the ground itself has since corrected the record. At Edicts Hill, in what is now Cambridgeshire, the dead from this period were laid to rest in a manner consistent with sudden mortality. Modern examination of their remains has revealed the presence of the plague bacterium itself. The disease was not imagined nor imported later by story. It was present, and it was lethal. Those buried there were not only the old or already frail. Young adults appear among them, individuals who would normally have survived lesser illness. The disease moved through communities already destabilized by hunger and displacement, following paths of trade, travel, and refuge. Where people gathered in hope of assistance, the sickness gathered with them. In Wales, the illness came to be remembered as the Fad Felen, the Yellow Plague. The name reflects how little was understood about its nature and how deeply it impressed itself on memory. In the year 547, it claimed Maelgwn Gwynedd, ruler of the most powerful British kingdom of the West. Gildas had named him the Dragon of the Island, a man of authority and ambition. His death demonstrated that rank offered no protection. Whatever structures of leadership had survived famine and conflict proved equally vulnerable to disease. The loss of such figures carried consequences beyond grief. Leadership was already strained. When kings and war leaders died suddenly, succession faltered. Decisions went unmade. Protection weakened. In some regions, the dead outnumbered those able to tend to them. Burial practices were simplified. In certain places, houses were abandoned with belongings still inside, their occupants gone and no one left to reclaim the space. The plague did not erase Britain. It thinned it further, deepening the emptiness already carved by hunger and conflict. When it receded, it left behind a quieter landscape. Fewer voices, fewer claims, fewer hands to rebuild what had been lost. The disaster that had begun in the sky now completed its work among the living. After the world broke, the Britain that emerged from the middle of the 6th century was not the Britain that had entered it. The change was not marked by a single ending or a clear beginning, but by a narrowing, a gradual reduction in people, in possibilities, and in ways of living. What had survived the years of failed harvests, conflict, and disease did so unevenly, leaving behind a landscape that was thinner, quieter, and more fragile than before. Many of the smaller social units that had once defined life on the island were no longer viable. Households that depended on a few fields or a modest herd had been lost, scattered, or absorbed. In their place, larger groupings began to take shape, not because they promised abundance, but because they offered a measure of security. Authority became more concentrated, not through design, but through necessity. Those who could command people, land, or food held power simply because survival now required it. In the north and east, new leaders emerged during these years, often remembered later by names and genealogies that give the impression of certainty. In reality, their rise was shaped as much by absence as by ambition. Empty land could be claimed, vacant settlements could be reoccupied. The balance between British and Anglo-Saxon power shifted not through conquest alone, but through uneven loss. Some regions recovered more quickly than others, some never did. The Western kingdoms, more exposed to long-distance sea routes and earlier trade connections, appear to have suffered particularly heavy losses. Leadership faltered as rulers died unexpectedly and succession became uncertain. In the East, where communities were already more dispersed and inward-looking, recovery followed a different path. Over time, these differences hardened into patterns that would define the political landscape of the centuries that followed. What did not survive were the countless lives lived beyond record, The men, women, and children who endured the first dim years, who waited for harvests that never came, who weakened and disappeared without witness, left no names behind them. Their presence is felt only indirectly, in abandoned houses, in interrupted settlement patterns, in the physical traces of stress preserved in bone and tooth. Memory did not vanish entirely. The experience of those years lingered, reshaped and retold, carried forward as story rather than chronicle. Later generations spoke of a great winter that came before the end of the world, or of a wounded land that could not heal until order was restored. These were not precise recollections, but echoes, attempts to give shape to a time when the familiar rhythms of the year failed. Today, the landscape bears little outward sign of what occurred. Fields are worked again. The sun rises and sets as expected. Seasons follow one another without hesitation. Yet beneath the surface, the evidence remains. Trees that grew through those years carry the memory in the narrowness of their rings. Ice far to the north holds the dust that dimmed the sky. Human remains preserve the marks of hunger and illness long after the names have faded. The people who lived through the middle of the 6th century did not know they were passing through a turning point in history. They were not building a future world. They were enduring the present one. That they survived at all, that life continued, altered but unbroken, is the only conclusion their world ever allowed. The darkness lifted eventually, not suddenly, and not everywhere at once, but enough for the year to begin moving forward again. Those who remained took up the work of living as they always had, without ceremony, without assurance, and without knowing how close the world they knew had come to slipping away entirely. Thank you for spending this time with the Candlelight Historian. Until next time, keep the candle burning.